Hello, welcome to our first programming tutorial on the Python language. I'm recording this for a class I'm teaching in fall of 2020. In the class, students are expected to have already programmed in another language. This tutorial is for students who have not programmed in Python before. And I am going to be demonstrating some very simple Python using Visual Studio Code. So I've asked my students to install this if they don't already have a favorite text editor. And I'm working in Windows. For most of the class, we will work in Linux. But for these first couple of weeks, I expect most of my students to be working in Windows simply because they're comfortable with that and they may not have worked with Linux before. And I want to make sure everybody gets started being able to program in Python because our first few homeworks will require that. All right, so what I've done is I've started Visual Studio Code, right? And we can create a simple Python file. We don't have to create a workspace or a folder, but today I will just go ahead and work from a folder. So I have the choice of open folder. I could get that choice as well by going to File, Open Folder. I have a blank folder here that I just called Lessons to use for today's code that we write. Let me maximize this, right? You may not have this terminal up and running at first because I've been previously running this, but here in my lessons folder, we could go ahead and click on new file. Oh, here, let me close the settings window. All right, didn't matter that it was open, I was just changing some settings before, right? Some font settings. So here in the lessons folder, I can click on new file, or I can also go to file, new file, but click on new file. And you probably might have trouble seeing it, but in this box, the cursor's flashing. We give our file a name, right? Start with a letter of the alphabet. Try not to use any special characters, maybe other than an underscore in your file name. So I'm just going to call this lesson 01. And with Python, we're going to end our file extension in py. So .py, that stands for Python. So I'm going to hit the enter key. And now Visual Studio Code knows by this file extension of py that we are writing a Python program. All right, so depending on what language you've worked in the past, I came from a C, C++ background to Python, and I was used to having to write a main function. But in Python, we do not have to do that. Later, we will learn to write a main function, but we can just start writing our code here. We don't have to write it in other functions, right? And Python uses what's called an interpreter. If we just start writing our code here, it's just going to start with our first line, generally the way we're going to write this, and execute the code in order. And we're going to do the classic hello program right now instead of hello world. So if you want to print something out to the screen, right, the Python function is print. I'm also working in Python 3.8.5, so Python 3, and that's what we'll be using in this course. Right, so print, and then we need parentheses. And so I hit the left parenthesis and the code editor because I've set up the Python extensions as I've asked you to do. Then shows us the function, right? This is the documentation for the print function. There's a lot of things going on in here, right? We could go out and take a look at what all these different fields are, but we really don't want to customize much at this point. All we want to do is print out hello. And so hello is a string of characters. And to specify the string of characters, right, we are just going to type, I'm going to type a single quote. It gave me a pair, and I'm going to say hello. So you'll find in Python, character strings go in between either a set of single quotes or a set of double quotes, right? Either one. Python's very flexible. And you'll want to use double quotes. If you use double quotes, then you can actually put a single quote inside your string, or if you need to put double quotes inside the string that you want printed out, then you would enclose everything in single quotes. Guess I'm getting off the subject. I can show you that later. All right, so all we want it to do is to print out hello. And what we can do here in Visual Studio Code is there's a run button up here. There's a run menu. We can also right click on the screen and choose run Python file in terminal, right? That's going to save what we just did. And so here's our terminal. And what it's doing here is it actually then called where I have the Python executable language stored. So it's starting Python and then it's running this file. And all it did was give us the output of hello. Right? Control plus. I can make this bigger and you can see the output of hello. Right? Let me shrink that down. All right. And so like I said, you can use double quotes, single quotes. So if I wanted to say hello, and if I wanted to put, say, maybe world inside of double quotes where I want the double quotes to print out, then I enclose both ends of the string here in single quotes. All right, let's just run our code again. And down here, you can see that it printed out hello, space, double quote, world, double quote. Similarly, like I said, if we wanted to, for some reason, print out single quotes, so I'm going to start my string with a double quote. I'm going to put single quotes around world, and I'm going to end with a double quote. Same thing, if we rerun this, now we get hello world, and we get the single quotes output. All right. So it's a very flexible language. All right. So this is how we print strings out to the screen, right? Later we'll get into working with mathematical variables, but for some of our first homework, we'll actually be using some input and output functions. You'll be doing a little bit of math. So let's take a look at then how we could set up a string variable, and then we'll use the input function. Right. So I'm going to create a string variable called message. So MSG, and I'm going to set that equal to or assigned to at the end, right, our hello. Right, same way string, single quotes, double quotes. Right, and now I'm going to say print MSG. So what I've done here is I've created then this variable, this string variable MSG. I've assigned, that's what the equals operator does. I've assigned then the string hello to it. And it will print out our message if we say run that. And there's our hello that it printed out. Right. And we could create many variables. Oh, the one thing I didn't mention, you've probably noticed, is that by default, right, this print writes a new line character. Right. Notice that hello is on a line all by itself, but let's print out a thing. So we're just going to, let's print out the string line 2. Maybe we'll print out the string line 1. And let's run this. And you can see here, hopefully you can see, let me maybe bump this up again. All right, notice we've got line 1 on a line all by itself. So this will print out what's inside our string, and then it ends with a new line character. So the next time we call print, the print statement, right, by default behavior is it will start things on a new line. Right, so if you're coming from C and C++, your printing functions, you have to always give it a new line character. And there are ways to override that in Python, right? Well, we won't get into that here. Those are good things to Google and learn how to do, but you can override that behavior if you want. All right, so I said, and the objective really of this lesson is to read some input from the keyboard and display it then to the screen. So instead of, well, we can actually then, and you can have blank lines. There's a function called input. Input reads from the keyboard, right? So I type input, I type the left and right parentheses, and it comes up and it starts showing us some information about the function, right? So param prompt, well, we're going to see that the prompt is a message we can display, a string message, and it's going to ring. This tells us it's going to read a string from standard output, and it's going to strip off the trailing new line. So whenever we type something from the keyboard, right, we always end our input with hitting the enter key, and that generally generates a new line character. Well, this is telling you it's not going to be stored in the string. It says the prompt string, if given, is printed to standard output without a trailing new line before reading the input, right? And if we hit end of file, right, so Control Z, it will just stop our program from running. Sometimes Control C works as well. But what we want to do is So if we were to just run this with input now, with no prompt, and so if I said run Python file in terminal, well, what's happening down here in the terminal is we've just got the cursor waiting here, right? Without printing a message to the user, right? We don't know that we're supposed to enter something. But I could type anything I want, hit the enter key, and it read that string in. We have no way of telling that because we didn't save it to a variable. So let's put our prompt here. So our prompt is a string. It can go in single or double quotes. So let's just say enter some words or enter something. Worst part is me determining message. Enter text. How's that? All right. And we want to capture then what this function returns, that text. So we'll just call this, I'm just going to call this message 1. So we call the function. It's going to display this message enter text on the screen, and it's going to read what we type at the keyboard, and it will store that in message 1. And let's just go ahead and print out. So we can say print message 1. So let's have it display then what we typed in, right? So let's run this. And let me bump this up bigger and let me close. No, I was going to close that Explorer window, but let me just bump this up bigger. All right, so see how this says enter text? Now the cursor is sitting right after text. You know, I might have wanted to leave a space to make this look a little bit nicer for the user. But I'll just say, hello world. All right. And so that read that in, stored it in message 1, and then you can see it printed back out what we typed in. And notice then it reads spaces, right? So it doesn't stop. A space doesn't cause this to stop. What this will do is this will read in everything it sees up until you hit that enter key press, which is that new line character. So if we have multiple words, right, it will then read in multiple words and store them in that string. All right. All right. So let's just say enter number. All right. And I'll call this num1. And let's read in a second number. So enter number, right? So we're going to have this execute twice, and let's just print out num1, print num2. Let's run this. All right, so down here it's prompting me and number. Well, I'm just going to give it the number 1, and then I'm going to give it the number 2. And so when it's done entering and storing things, then our print statements execute. It prints out the number 1 and number 2. So this then executes our code in order, right? From this first line, it then prompted us to enter a number. It stored that in this variable number 1, right? It read from the keyboard again, stored that in number 2. Then the next statement it executed was this print num1, and the last statement it executed was print num2, right? One thing about an interpreter is that an interpreted language will often execute all the lines, all the code it can until it reads in an error. So if I change this statement to say print num3, I don't have a variable defined that's num3. So I'm just going to click on run Python file in terminal. And so down here, it says enter a number. So once again, I'll just enter the number 1, enter number. I'm going to enter the number 2. And it printed out the number 1, but then we get these error messages. So you'll see trace back, right? Most recent call last, right? And what it's telling you right here is in this particular file, right, that we're working in, because sometimes you can have multiple files running, right? You can be importing things from other files. And so you'll want to see what file that the error occurred in, but in this case it says print num3 and it says name error. Name num3 is not defined. Well, notice Python as an interpreted language works differently than, I keep going back to C or C++, but other languages that are compiled languages, right, where you have to compile and create an executable, right? Well, the compilation step in other languages picks up on syntax errors, right? Here in Python, then it will run the code until it reaches that error statement. If the code never needs to execute a statement that's an error statement, you won't necessarily know that error exists. For instance, if we had this in some sort of if-else condition, if the condition was never true and it never tried to execute that branch, you wouldn't know that error exists. Well, one of the things that when you install the Python extension for Visual Studio, it came with something called a linter. And a linter then will actually go through and tell you about syntax error. So notice how num3 here is underlined with sort of a red squiggly. And that says undefined variable num3. And so pylint, so that's the linter. Right? It's named pylint, and it's telling us then that we have an error. So if we paid attention to this before we executed, right, we would have caught that error and corrected it. But, right. So that is a handy feature to have installed. So once again, if we were to just say, okay, I changed that to num2, I saved it. When I saved it, notice that red squiggly went away. It understands num2. I'm hovering over num2, and notice then it says str. Well, that tells you the type of variable string. And if you want to even know what a data type is of a variable, this has helped me a bit with learning Python, because we're going to see there's all kinds of different objects. Sometimes I'm not sure if I have a tuple, an array, a list. And so if I want to know the data type of the object, it could be a class object. You can call a function called type. So I'm going to say print type, then, and I'll say num2. We saw it was a string, right? And once again, then let's run our code. And so enter a number. I'll pick 3 and I'll pick 19. All right. And so it printed out the 3, it printed out the 19. And then when it executed this statement, print type num2, right, it printed out then class string str. So that tells us what our data type is. All right. Now we can print some other information as well when we print out these strings. So I could here in single or double quotes, I could say something like, oh, well, I want to say what variable I'm printing out. So num2. And then I'm going to say plus, sorry, I said num2, but it's num1, plus num1. The plus operator, when used with strings, just says append that string onto the end. Right. And so if we run this now, right, we'll enter some numbers, 56, 9. Right, so now you can see with our message, right, we could then put some text in here to describe what we're printing out, and we just appended then to the end that the value of that variable. Now we can do that appending whenever that's a string type, right? Otherwise, we didn't change our other print statements, so we just saw the number 9. Right, because it's often handy to print things out with labels. If you're printing out multiple things and you don't have a label, it can become very confusing as to know what they are. All right, let's try one other thing now. So let's print out, let's see what happens if we say, let's print num1 plus num2. All right, we haven't started working with any math or anything. Right. These are both strings. Let's just go ahead and run this and see what our output is. So, right, so I'm going to enter the number 1 and then the number 2. Right. And if Python were thinking of these as number types, and this was a mathematical operator for addition, right, we would expect that 1 plus 2 would print out the number 3. But because the data type of this is string, what it does is it concatenates or it appends. So it just says, take what's in this first string and add immediately to the end of it what's in the second string. So there's no space or anything between. So it's printing the 1 and then it's printing the 2. So it does that with string data type. So whenever you use the plus operator with a string data type, it just says append something onto the end. Very similarly to what we did before with that label that we printed out and then said append that value onto the end. So you have to be aware of your data types, right? Because if you're expecting math to happen, it's not going to happen, right? Because this input function returns a string. Right. And there's there's tons of good tutorials on the internet, right? I am at docspython.org, which I believe I've linked to in one of the tutorial information for the first lesson that I've given you. And so if you come here, right, it clicks, or it has all these built-in functions. So one of these is the input function, right, which just takes us down to this definition, right? And so input prompt, right, it says if the prompt is present, it's written to standard output, which is the screen without a trailing new line. We said that before, right? The function reads a line from the input, converts it to a string. That's the important thing to know. It converts it to a string. Well, what if we needed this to be an integer, right? What if we wanted to read integers from the keyboard? Oh. Right. So let's create a variable called sum. Let's assign to sum. Well, if we assign to sum the value of num1 plus num2, we're going to see that 1, 2 print out on the screen like we just did before. So what we should see if we run this is we're going to see 1, 2. Well, assuming I enter 1 and a 2. So I'm going to enter 1, I'm going to enter 2. Notice it says the sum, well, it looks like it's 12. All right, 1 plus 2. It's normally not 12. Right. So what we can do is look at strings. So we hover over that, says it's a string. There's multiple different ways we could do this. We could actually just say, call the function int for integer, right? This class, and say, I want you to convert what's in num1. So if what's stored in there is a numeric value, a string, a character string that represents a numeric value, it can convert to an integer, it will do that. And same way, do the same thing for num2. And now let's run that, print it out. So here's our 1, here's our 2, and we get an error. All right. So this error we get, it says it can only concatenate a string, not an int. Well, here's what Python does. Because we added 2 integers together, it made the data type of sum int, right? We hover over that, we can see it's an int. And what I said before is when we're using the print function and we're using this plus, it expects this variable to be of type string. Because it's not, it threw an error. So if we wanted to just make this of type string, we call str, convert it to a string function. Right. Now we run this. We enter the number 1, the number 2, and we get our sum of number 3 out here on the screen. Right. Now you have to be aware then, right, that the input function returns things as a string. If you want to treat them as numeric values, then you have to convert them. And I converted it here, but let's try another method of doing this. Right. What if we call the input function, but here, what if I said take what's returned by the input function, pass that then to this integer class constructor here. And notice if I hover over num2 now, that's no longer a string. It says it's going to be an int. Let's get rid of that parenthesis there. right? And so same way. Now, if we run this, all right, if I enter 1, enter 2, all right, we get our sum of 3. And now these variables are integer types, simply because, like I said, input returns the string, but we said, well, return that string, pass that string to this value, to this class constructor, and to make it an integer. All right, and by default, you can see what's popping up here on the screen is it's going to make it a base 10 integer. By default, we're working in base 10, as with most programming languages that we use. All right, and you can play around with this, right? Since we said convert those to integers, what happens if we say run the Python file in the terminal? So it's waiting for input. What happens if I enter the number 1 and then I enter the letter A? Right? And now we get an error, right? It's telling us then in this function called input, and it's telling us invalid literal for int with base 10 A. So what it's saying is, well, I don't know how to convert A to an integer, right? So it errors out, your program stops running, right? So it gives you some good feedback as to, it's very descriptive of what the error is, and that time it was a user input error. Your program didn't do anything wrong, it just couldn't do the conversion because the user didn't enter an integer. So Python has strings, ints, another data type it has for floating point, it has floats. So what if I said now, instead of making these an int, what if I said call the float constructor, right? Notice if I do that, the data type of num1 and num2 is now float. The data type of sum is float. We're adding 2 floats together. Same way here, let's run this. Now we could run integer, we could enter integers, right? I could say 1 and 2, and that converts it to a floating point number, basically 1.0, 2.0. Notice we get our sum of 3.0 here, right? So because it's floating point, in this case, it looks like the default is it's giving us 1 decimal past the decimal point. But if we run this, right, again, let's enter some different numbers. So what happens if I enter 1.11 and 3.92? All right, well, my sum then is 5.03, which is correct. All right, and now it gave us 2 decimal places. Right, it didn't give us any more because there wasn't anything to the right of the decimal. If we run this again, what happens if I say, well, 1 divided by 3? So division, right, is this /? What if I said entered 1 divided by 3? I don't know if it can convert that. Let's find out. No, it can't. Cannot convert value string to float because it took this as a string of 1 / 3. It didn't have a way of doing math with that. So user error once again, right? Like I said, you can play around with this. 0.33, right? 0.667, right? And now we get more decimal places. So as in most any language that represents floating point is not perfect because of the limited amount of memory. There are some things that can't be perfectly represented in memory. Right. So if we were adding this together on paper, we would have said this was 0.997. This says 0.997, but because of the way it had to represent these numbers in memory, so it's basically converting base 10 to binary. It only has so many bits to store this information in, and the way that it's stored when it recreates, when it puts everything back from binary to base 10, we often get some of these small errors. I mean, this is a very small error, right, in this case. All right, I think that's it for our first lesson in Python, right, of just how do we work with input, right? Remembering that input then returns everything as a string. If we want to convert it to ints or floats, right, we have different ways of doing that. Right, we could have done the conversion we could have done a conversion here of the math, have simply performed the math here inside this function as well. There's lots of different ways we could do things, right? So play around with it a little bit. Like I said, in some sample code that I'll be giving you then, right, I'll be using the input function, the print function. So having seen this tutorial will give you an idea of what we're doing in class. Right. All right, thanks for watching. Hope this helped you get started with the basics of Python.